If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Following the unsuccessful attempt by Winfield Scott Hancock and Philip Sheridan to cut the railroad north of Richmond that resulted in the Battle of First Deep Bottom, the second part of that operation was still set to take place, the explosion of the mine dug by the 9th Corps troops. Army Commander George Meade ordered the mine exploded at 3:30 a.m. on July 30th. 9th Corps Commander Ambrose Burnside wanted to use his division of African American troops to spearhead the attack that took place following the explosion. For pretty much all of the Overland Campaign, Burnside's division of black soldiers under Edward Ferrero were held back, guarding wagon trains or digging earthworks for other corps. Since they had not endured the brutal attacks from the Wilderness to Cold Harbor, their ranks were fuller than the rest of the divisions of his corps, so he chose them to make the attack once the black powder explosion broke the Confederate line. For 2 weeks, while Pennsylvania miners turned soldiers dug the tunnel underneath the Confederates, Ferrero trained his troops in what would be expected of them in that attack. During the advance, some of the regiments would break off and advance along the flank as guards to widen the breach and push back any Confederates in their way. When Burnside informed Meade that he had chosen Ferrero's black troops as the assault force, Meade balked at the thought, saying that he couldn't send those inexperienced troops into battle. Plus, he didn't want the flanking maneuver performed, deciding that the assault column needed to make a direct assault. Burnside had more faith in the African American soldiers than the Army commander, but now Burnside would need to choose another attacking force. He had 3 other divisions to choose from. James Ledley's division was the freshest, not having been on the front lines in a couple of weeks, but his most dependable divisions were more shot up from the fighting across Virginia. After consulting with his generals, they couldn't decide who would lead the assault. Burnside put their 3 names in a hat, probably his own, and drew out a name. Ledley's name was on it. His division would lead the attack with the other divisions giving support. Meade ordered the 18th Corps and the 5th Corps to support Burnside's attack. Not only that, but the Chief of Artillery for the Army of the Potomac, Henry Hunt, assembled 110 cannons and 54 mortars to blast away at the Confederates after the detonation of the mine. Meade and General-in-Chief Ulysses S. Grant watched in the direction they knew the mine would explode, but by 4 a.m. nothing had happened. Grant rode to Meade's headquarters and inquired as to the delay. Meade wired Burnside, but Burnside wasn't sure about the delay either, but all suspected it had something to do with the fuses. No one's nervous anxiety exceeded that of Colonel Henry Pleasants. He, perched on a nearby earthwork, watch in hand, like a maniac, waiting for the culmination of more than a month of his labor. Sergeant Harry Reese and Lieutenant Jacob Doughty suspected that the problem resided at a place where the fuses had been spliced and presented this theory to Pleasants. The colonel considered this likely, but hesitated to allow his subordinates to re-enter the shaft until he could be reasonably certain that the charge would not blow. That time came at 4:15 a.m. The 2 intrepid volunteers plunged into the shaft and discovered that near the tamping at about the halfway point of the fuse trail, where splices connected 2 links, the fire had, indeed, sputtered out. Reese may have rushed out of the mine to retrieve a knife to repair the damage, and then returned to relight the fuse, scrambling back out again with no little haste. At 4:44 a.m., the Confederate position erupted, mesmerizing the Union and rebel soldiers alike. For those caught up in the explosion, a chaotic upheaval of human flesh and debris was sent skyward. One Confederate described it as, "The ground reeled and throbbed beneath our feet as the volcano burst from the bowels of the earth, hurling upward men, cannon, logs, and vast boulders, obscuring the light of day. The fiends had launched their mine." A soldier caught in the explosion remembered, "God only knows how high it sent me. I spread my wings to see if I could fly, but the first thing I knowed, I was lying on top of the works." Another wrote, "The astonishing effect of the explosion bursting like a volcano at the feet of the men and upheaving an immense column of more than 100,000 cubic feet of earth fell around in heavy masses, wounding, crushing, or burying everything in its path." Around 352 Confederates fell victim to the blast. The destruction to the Confederate line wasn't complete. That was just the beginning. Within seconds of the explosion, the 164 artillery pieces placed by Henry Hunt and others erupted from the Union side, sending shot and shell into the chaotic scene. One Virginia soldier described the scene in eloquent language. The grand chorus of artillery which immediately succeeded the explosion was such a roar as would fitly herald the introduction of fiends from the lower regions, and was played by an orchestra that combined its awful diapason, all the notes from the shrill treble of the whistle and shell to the heavy bass of the Dahlgren or mortar. Within minutes of the explosion, probably just enough time for the smoke and the dust to settle so that some visibility could be gained, Ledley's division stepped off for the exposed Confederate position. They were supposed to move through the rebel line and take a rise just beyond it. That would give the Federal soldiers the high ground above the city of Petersburg. Instead, Ledley's men aimed for the crater and stayed there, attempting to extricate buried rebels that were still alive and take them as prisoners, and getting into a safe position to throw back a Confederate counterstrike that they expected. Griffin's brigade of Potter's division moved forward next, but try as Griffin might, the brigade seemed drawn to the crater instead of expanding the breach to the right. Hartramp's brigade of Wilcox's division was the next unit to move forward out of the trenches and through the no-man's land between the opposing entrenchments. But just like the other brigades, they gravitated toward the crater, only expanding the Union hold about 90 feet. A traffic jam emerged as the crater began to fill with a mass of humanity. Some of Hartramp's men began to unearth cannons, buried by the explosion, but they did little else with the area becoming filled with troops unwilling or unable to go further. Wilcox moved his command post within 70 yards of the crater and issued orders for Hartranft to move forward no matter what Ledley's division was doing. Hartranft, to protect his flank, attempted to guard his and the Corps' left flank by sending the 27th Michigan south. He was hoping to form a strong defensive line that ran from Confederate works on the left to the Jerusalem Plank Road on the right, but Confederate musketry drove the Wolverines away from the position, and the rest of Hartramp's brigade moved closer and into the crater. A lieutenant wrote, "It was as utterly impracticable to reform a brigade in that crater as it would be to marshal bees into line after upsetting their hive." One major reason for all the problems facing the Ninth Corps in that early morning was that no officer above a brigade commander was at the front. Wilcox was 70 yards behind, but others were even further, like Ledley, who went to a bomb-proof 50 yards behind the Union entrenchments, not knowing what was happening with his division. Burnside remained within view of the attack near a grouping of 14 artillery pieces. Meade didn't get close, relying on his communication with Burnside to keep him informed of the situation. Meade also reached out to Winfield Scott Hancock and Gouverneur K. Warren to help with their corps. To keep in contact with his divisions, Burnside assigned a staff officer with each of his divisions. When the staff officer connected to Ledley's division went to Burnside, he didn't know that Burnside had moved his headquarters to the field, and instead went to Burnside's formal headquarters, where Meade had ventured. Meade got the message that Ledley's division was floundering and not moving forward, which angered the army commander. Burnside in his reports had portrayed the attacks as somewhat successful, but this report from the front contradicted Burnside's messages. He ordered Burnside to push his corps toward Cemetery Hill in the rear of the Confederate entrenchments. Then he wired Warren and Hancock, telling them to look for an opportunity and a weakness in the enemy line, telling them that if Burnside's attack became successful, the enemy would have no choice but to break in their front from the assault. However, as one historian put it, apparently it did not occur to Meade to consider the situation in reverse. Rather than waiting for Burnside's success to trigger supporting attacks on his flanks, might not such attacks have weakened the resistance at the salient and facilitate a favorable outcome at the crater? A heated exchange resulted between Burnside and Meade. Burnside wired Meade, "I am doing all in my power to push the troops forward, and if possible, we will carry the crest. It is hard work, but we hope to accomplish it. I am fully alive to the importance of it." Meade replied, "What do you mean by hard work to take the crest? I understand not a man has advanced beyond the enemy's line, which you occupied immediately after exploding the mine. Do you mean to say your officers and men will not obey your orders to advance? If not, what is the obstacle? I wish to know the truth and desire an immediate answer." Burnside in turn stated, "I have never in any report said anything different from what I conceive to be the truth. Were it not insubordinate, I would say that the latter remark of your note was unofficerlike and ungentlemanly." The rift between the two officers widened with the chaos of the crater. The Confederates weren't entirely thrown into confusion. Undoubtedly, the explosion destroyed Pegram's battery, and confusion reigned around the crater for a while, exacerbated by the influx of Burnside's Ninth Corps capturing the crater and some of the works. Quickly, troops from around the Petersburg defenses came to the scene to throw back the Federals. The Ninth Corps troops of Ambrose Burnside, who made it into the crater and just outside of the depression, were hit by infantry as well as artillery fire soon after capturing the location. The Confederates had positioned mortars with the appropriate time fuse to hit their own salient in the event that the rumors of a mine were true. Now those mortars let loose a flurry of iron and lead, forcing the blue-coated defenders to look for cover. The Confederate units that were hit by the explosion and responded to the immediate Union threat were regiments in the division of Bushrod Johnson. Johnson served most of his Civil War career in the West, but came east with Longstreet earlier that year in 1864. He had a detached relationship with his brigades, rarely visiting the front, mostly staying at his headquarters near the Jerusalem Plank Road. The commander of Henry Wise's brigade, Colonel John Good, worked to place his Virginia units to combat Burnside's soldiers, and then sent a message to Johnson to give us the benefit of his judgment. Johnson sent his aide, Lieutenant John E. Saunders, to say that my arrangements were very good or excellent, and to hold the works at all hazards. That was the last I heard of him until the battle was practically over. The absence of Johnson didn't mend any of the rifts between himself and his subordinates. Corps Commander A.P. Hill heard the explosion and suspected its cause. He quickly got dressed and rode to where the explosion came from. He dispatched a staffer to tell William Mahone, one of his division commanders, to rush as many troops as he could spare to the northeast. Mahone took 2,000 men in an effort to save the Confederate line. Information of the explosion got to Robert E. Lee, who made his way from Violet Bank, his headquarters, to the Petersburg front. He sent a staffer ahead to count the number of Union battle flags at the crater. The staffer counted 11, signaling to Lee that the Union were there in heavy force. The sun was rising, being between 5 a.m. and 6 a.m. It was after 7 a.m. when Burnside rushed more men to the front. Zenas Bliss's brigade of Robert Potter's division was going to try to sweep north and capture the Confederate works with 5 regiments, but when the 3 regiments on the left got to the crater, the mass of humanity halted them. The 2 regiments to the right, the 2nd New York Mounted Rifles and the 51st New York Infantry, got bogged down against the handful of rebels manning the works. The 45th Pennsylvania, 58th Massachusetts, and 4th Rhode Island were told by the units in the depression to charge and capture an artillery battery, but when they left the crater, a withering fire from musketry and artillery ripped into their ranks, diminishing any chance the units had in successfully leaving the crater. Next came the order for Burnside's African American division to attack the crater. Edward Ferrero's infantry brigades formed with Joshua Siegfried's brigade in front and Henry Thomas's brigade behind them. They marched across the no-man's land between the 2 entrenchments, with officers outside the crater attempting to direct them around the crater. But it was no use. The brigade naturally maneuvered into the depression, like all the rest, where they got entangled in the growing number of soldiers, living, dead, and dying in the crater. The attacking black units went into the crater with some declaring no quarter and remember Fort Pillow. By 8:30 a.m., an order came to Colonel Delavan Bates of the 30th USCT to charge toward Cemetery Hill behind the Confederate lines. It took about 15 minutes to organize 500 men for the push outside the crater. The colonel took only 5 or 10 steps before a minie-ball penetrated his skull near the right ear, passed above the roof of his mouth, and exited near his left ear. Members of his regiment put their commander on a rubber blanket and carried him to the rear, thinking him a dying man. He would survive and receive the Medal of Honor for his actions. Thomas's brigade attempted to break out from the crater as well, but they didn't make it far toward their goal of the Jerusalem Plank Road and Cemetery Hill before falling back to the crater. John Wesley Turner, a 10th Corps division commander, couldn't see any point in attacking when he viewed the scene before Ferrero's division moved in, but his commander told him that if the black troops moved forward, he should as well. Turner's men dashed across no man's land and secured a lodgment near the Confederate works, but didn't extend it to any significant degree. On the left, the last Ninth Corps Brigade would make their attack. William Humphrey advanced with the artillery on the Confederate right, unleashing a horrible volley into the flank of the brigade. The New York and Pennsylvanians buckled and then fled, leaving the Michiganders to attack the crater. The 20th Michigan put up a tough fight as they sent lead into the rebels as quickly as they could, but the mass of humanity in and around the crater made it difficult to help the situation. By 9 a.m., the last of the Union assaults ended. Roughly 10,000 Union soldiers were now crammed into 500 yards of captured Confederate works. At 10 a.m., Grant wired Henry Halleck that the attack had failed. Grant then left the field to return to City Point. But the battle wasn't over. William Mahone was arriving with 2 brigades from his division to throw back the blue troops. Word came to Mahone's old brigade, now commanded by David Weisiger, that there were black troops ahead. One Virginia wrote, "When we first set out on our expedition, we did not know that we should be called about to lock horns with black troops, and that they had charged our works with the exultant cry, 'No quarter.' The information gained, a stranger would have noticed a quickening of the step, and each eye burned with a brighter glow, and each gun received a more than casual examination to see that it was properly loaded and ready for action." Another wrote, "I never felt more like fighting in my life. Our comrades had been slaughtered in a most inhumane and brutal manner, and black slaves were trampling over their mangled and bleeding forms. Revenge must have fired every heart and strung every arm with nerves of steel for the Herculean task of blood." Mahone didn't wait for all of his troops from both of his brigades to form before he ordered them to attack. Some Union soldiers, many of them black, had taken a position just outside of the crater behind some smaller earthworks. When the rebels got to them, horrendous hand-to-hand combat erupted. One Confederate described the scene. "For many minutes, which seemed like hours, amid the roar of artillery and musketry, the groans of the wounded, the prayers of the dying, and the imprecations of the living, men pierced each other's hearts and crushed each other's skulls until the place seemed a veritable hell." The Confederates pushed on to the crater, meeting resistance along the way. Numerous accounts from the Confederates and Federals testify to the brutality shown to the black troops of Edward Ferrero. At least one account relays the story of white Union soldiers who saw how the black soldiers were being killed by the Confederates, that they themselves bayoneted retreating black soldiers, hoping to get leniency from the rebels. Weisiger was wounded in the abdomen and carried to the rear. As he passed General Mahone, Mahone said, "Weisiger, you and Joe Johnston are always getting yourself shot." The expression was meant to be complimentary, but Weisiger took it as an insult and responded, "Yes, General Mahone, and if you would go where General Johnston and I go, you would get shot too." The fighting by Mahone's men around the crater took hours. Most of Mahone's men worked their way to the north end of the crater. Some stubborn Union soldiers stayed at the crater, waiting for orders to retreat. Others ran for their lives, but over 3 hours elapsed from the time Mahone's men first charged until around 1 p.m., the Alabamians under John C.C. Sanders charged. They pushed all the way up to the crater, looking inside, seeing only about 1,000 soldiers still in the depression. Some men fired their weapons into the crater, while others grabbed abandoned rifles with bayonets attached and hurled them like spears into the crater. Eventually, some rebel officers asked the beleaguered Federals if they wanted to surrender. They agreed and began to exit the crater. However, the black troops who surrendered weren't granted the same terms. As one South Carolinian wrote in his diary, "The black troops were slaughtered without mercy, we not allowing them to surrender. They huddled together in the pit formed by the explosion, and our men deliberately capped down on them and bayoneted them until worn out with exhaustion." However, some black troops were taken as captives, some survived, and some were killed while in Confederate custody. The Union High Command had long given out hope that their troops would do any good. When Meade removed to his permanent headquarters before noon, he did not bother to dispatch an aide or staff officer to ascertain the disposition of his forces. Indeed, the Army commander remained so uninformed that at 7:40 p.m. he sent a message to Burnside inquiring if the Ninth Corps still held the crater. Burnside, whose disgust with his superior overwhelmed his normal composure, tossed aside this and 2 identical inquiries without a reply, an act he later acknowledged was inexcusably insubordinate. Uncertain if either side would agree to a truce to collect the dead and wounded, a temporary armistice wasn't called until August 1st. Then, as one Alabama soldier wrote, Both armies, within 75 yards of each other, though invisible, now arose out of the ground as if by magic, and it seemed that the world was filled with people in a moment. The lower ranks began to collect their comrades, and even high-ranking officers on both sides came together to converse. Those included A.P. Hill, P.G.T. Beauregard, Mahone, Johnson, Archibald Gracie, Edward Ferrero, Julius White, and Robert Potter. The armistice formally ended at 9 a.m., but hostilities were delayed a little longer, while the last of the dead and dying were taken from the field. The number of casualties on both sides are hard to estimate, but some of the most commonly used numbers are the Union lost 3,800 men, with 1,400 of those casualties being captured or missing. The Confederacy lost nearly 1,500. In addition to throwing back the Union troops who broke their line, the Confederacy captured 22 Union flags and around 2,000 small arms. The Battle of the Crater sent a morale boost throughout the Confederacy, especially Richmond. After weeks of assault, Grant hadn't been able to capture Petersburg or cut off the supplies to the city. In the West, Atlanta was still in Confederate hands. The prevention of Union forces from gaining two of the most important cities in the Confederacy gave the Army of Northern Virginia more confidence in their struggle with Grant, but the conqueror of Vicksburg wasn't done with Petersburg. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you.